Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to introduce Professor Harry Arthurs. And I also, before I forget, because I almost certainly will, I've been asked and am pleased to acknowledge the support of Bennett Jones LLP for this session. I see the Dean nodding with relief. Professor Arthurs is the former Dean of Osgoode Hall Law School. He's the President Emeritus of York and has been for the past 8 years University Professor Emeritus. His many distinctions and honors are recorded on your conference program, and I won't review them except to add that I was mildly amused to see that he holds with Joseph Stiglitz the ILO Research Prize for, and I'm not making this up, decent work. For our purposes, one of Professor Arthurs' many distinctions is that he is at the center of a small group of legal scholars who have taken legal education seriously enough to write on its theory and implementation, and he's been part of an even smaller group who have actually been in a position to shape its future. Professor McLaren referred in his remarks this morning to the Arthurs Report, and I think almost everyone in this room knows what that is. It's the report of the Consultative Group on Research and Education, chaired 30 years ago by Professor Arthurs, and generated that report, which contained 56 recommendations intended to reform fundamentally law school teaching and scholarship. And he situated legal education as a vehicle not just for vocational training, but as a form of personal and professional formation informed by a wider interdisciplinary intellectual tradition of research and scholarship. And yet, the tensions that Professor Arthurs confronted, tensions between academic lawyers and practicing lawyers, and intra-academic tensions between doctrinal researchers and interdisciplinary scholars persist in legal education. And so it is very timely indeed. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Arthurs as our keynote speaker this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, we're all here to talk about the future of law school. That future depends on the future of many other things that are largely beyond anyone's control, especially the way developments in political economy, technology, demography, and society affect the legal system, the market for professional services, and the structure of higher education. But some factors are very much within the control of law schools. The identities they embrace, the values they cherish, the ambitions they pursue. These are the things that will determine whether they collaborate with or resist, succumb to or transcend the powerful forces that I've mentioned. They will determine whom law schools hire as faculty and admit as students, what and how they teach, the standards they use to measure achievements, and the way they allocate their scarce resources. And crucially, they will determine how, if at all, law schools will exploit their strategic location as producers and distributors, as conservators and critics of legal and social knowledge. I'm going to present three quite different views of what law schools ought to be and what they ought to do. The first holds that their primary, if not their sole function, should be to produce practice-ready lawyers for today's profession. The second is that they should produce tomorrow's lawyers with the capacity to adapt to the rapidly and radically changing circumstances of legal practice. And the third is that law schools should play a leading role in the creation and transformation of legal knowledge, legal practice, and legal system, a role that by the way, requires them to provide their students with a large and liberal understanding of law so as to prepare them for a variety of legal and non-legal careers. I'll end up by making a prediction about which model represents the future of law schools, if you haven't guessed already. I'll begin with the widely held view that it's the job of law schools to produce practice-ready lawyers. This is the view of Canada's law societies, which have recently required that law schools ensure that their students possess certain kinds of substantive knowledge and acquire certain competencies so that they will be prepared to enter practice. Unfortunately, producing practice-ready lawyers is something law schools simply cannot do. The problem is that no one knows what practice-ready lawyers look like. We lack information about what legal practitioners do, what knowledge or competencies they actually need or use, what breadth and depth of knowledge will qualify new graduates as ready to practice, or how long they will remain ready before what they learned at law school becomes obsolete. These are empirical questions. However, they were neither asked nor answered before the law societies adopted their new regulations. That said, we know one thing for sure about the profession. It is fractured along a number of deep fault lines. These lines run vertically and divide general practitioners from specialists, specialists from each other, and both from the remaining 30 or 35% of law graduates employed outside the private practice of law in government agencies, clinics, or corporate law departments, or in non-legal capacities in business, the media, or politics. No less importantly, in private practice, the fault lines run horizontally as well as vertically. The profession is stratified. As one descends from higher to lower strata, the clientele tends to become less affluent, the work less complex and more routine, and the rewards, of course, more meager. For these reasons, as one traverses the grid formed by these intersecting vertical and horizontal fault lines, it's almost certain that the scope and depth of what lawyers need to know changes as well. If I'm right, if what lawyers need to know in order to be practice ready varies considerably from one kind of practice to another, we arrive at an important conclusion. One size of legal education will not fit all law graduates. But quite inexplicably, Canada's law societies believe that it will. They have recently decreed that all law schools must ensure that all students require all competencies and knowledge of all the substantive subjects specified in their new regulations. Not surprising, I guess, because law societies assume that not only all new graduates, but all established practitioners know the same thing. That's why they allow all lawyers to undertake any kind of work that clients may entrust to them, murder trials or IPOs, divorces or patent applications. That's why they don't retest lawyers to ensure that they've kept their law school learning up to date, and why they almost never discipline lawyers for incompetence or ignorance. To reiterate, the official position seems to be since law societies conclusively presume all lawyers to be omnicompetent, they must all be trained in the same way. This totally ignores the effects of specialization and stratification the two forces that most powerfully determine what lawyers need to know in order to practice competently. And law societies ignore something else as well. The relentless change that's destabilizing existing legal institutions, rules, processes, and patterns of practice. By contrast, the Canadian Bar Association, in its recent Legal Futures discussion paper, identifies the drivers of legal change: technology, politics, economics, and demography. And we know from everyday observation that family structures, business practices, regulatory technology, forms of property, patterns of social deviance, strategies of social control, all of these are in flux. Consequently, statutes are amended, common law rules mutate, and legal routines and boilerplate change more frequently and dramatically than they used to do. The implications for legal education are important. As the CBA's discussion paper notes, and I quote, "With the speed of change taking place in the legal environment, choices must be made at the beginning of a student's course of study. Students made at the beginning of a course of study may be outdated by the time he or she completes all of the necessary requirements for practice." Requirements, to reiterate, that have been chiseled in stone by Canada's law societies. I'll walk you through a few obvious examples. Over 3 or 4 decades, globalization has transformed the production of goods and services, corporate structures, the international division of labor, the dissemination of intellectual property and finance capital, and as a consequence, the norms, modalities, and location of many regimes of corporate governance and regulation. And these developments, in turn, have dramatically altered the market for legal services, the structure of the law and consulting firms that deliver these services, the knowledge base of lawyers who advise global businesses, the content of law school curricula, and the focus of legal scholarship. Technology next. Technology has not only enabled globalization, it's had a direct effect on legal services. Some examples. By facilitating the digitization, outsourcing, or offshoring of routine back-of-house functions, as we heard from Professor Siskin today. Technology has allowed large law firms to reduce their complement of articling students and junior associates, which in turn has destabilized their business model. By disseminating legal information online, technology has allowed retail purchasers of standard legal services to access self-help sites. This has enabled online service providers to undercut the lower-tier law firms that once supplied such services as their core business. And by enabling electronic searches, technology has not only made legal research faster and cheaper, it's blurred the boundaries amongst legal categories and between law and adjacent disciplines. Now a brief word about demography. Like the rest of the Canadian workforce, the legal profession is aging, is attracting more women, and is growing more ethnically diverse. These developments have affected the deployment, prosperity, governance, and education of lawyers. Some illustrations. Diversity has forced large law firms to embrace meritocracy as a recruitment policy, undermined the image of law as a gentleman's profession, and generated pressures for greater democracy in the profession's governing bodies. Meritocracy, in turn, has also converted law schools into gatekeepers whose badges of merit largely determine which graduates will gain access to the most coveted opportunities the profession has to offer. However, meritocracy hasn't completely won the day. The usual suspects continue to be disadvantaged. Many highly qualified women feel obliged to leave elite firms for jobs in government and corporate law departments where they find the work environment more supportive. And students from some immigrant and racialized groups who often confront economic, linguistic, and social barriers before, during, and after law school tend to cluster in disproportionate numbers in lower-tier solo practices or small firms. These new patterns of recruitment and practice have undermined the bar's traditional reliance on informal socialization as a strategy for instilling professional values in its members. Perhaps this explains why law societies have recently decreed that law schools must instruct their students in professionalism, a project that the profession itself is no longer willing or able to undertake, underwrite, or even define. I've tried to show how political economy, technology, and demography have become drivers of change not only in legal rules and institutions, but in legal practice and ultimately legal education. However, to reiterate, the profession's governing bodies have ignored the challenge of educating lawyers for an uncertain future just as resolutely as they've ignored the need for hard evidence about how lawyers actually practice in a multidimensional present. One thing's certain: making graduating students tick all the boxes on an arbitrary list of competencies in fields of substantive law is no way to ensure that they will be practice ready when they are called, much less that they will stay practice ready. The CBA's discussion paper, which is very future-oriented, somewhat tentatively suggests, I quote again, that law faculties should continue to play an important role in teaching the theory of law, legal principles, and legal reasoning. And it then adds, while some observers would have them place increased emphasis on the practice of law, law schools in their current form may not be the best option for providing practice training. This suggestion that law schools should focus on theory, principles, and reasoning, the skepticism about their role in practice training, is in part intended to ensure, of course, that law graduates have the intellectual tools they need to adapt to the changing but unpredictable requirements of legal and other careers. But in part, it represents a strong hint that law schools should focus on what they do best. So, what do they do best? Law schools are knowledge communities. They exist to collect, critique, produce, and disseminate knowledge. We therefore need briefly to consider what we mean by knowledge in the context of law. Obviously, the profession is, or should be, as concerned about knowledge as the academy. After all, its monopoly over legal practice rests on the claim that lawyers know things that other people don't. However, the profession and the academy relate to knowledge somewhat differently. Practitioners tend to consume knowledge, academics to produce it. Practitioners tend to know what they need to know, academics to know what they want to know. Practitioners tend to treat knowledge as a given, academics to treat it as contingent, as being constantly revised by new evidence, new methodologies, new theories. practitioners and academics both need to master non-legal domains of knowledge, but many practitioners are reluctant to admit this, while most academics celebrate interdisciplinarity. And finally, practitioners especially value tacit knowledge, practical knowledge that is gained through experience, disseminated through mentorship, and deployed by instinct or reflex. Academics prize explicit knowledge, knowledge that can be systematized, taught, published, and challenged. Clearly, disagreements between the academy and the profession about the nature of knowledge are at the root of disagreements over who should control law schools, the profession's governing bodies, or the universities and their law faculties. The future of law schools, and I argue, the future of law as a profession, social institution, and intellectual discipline, the future depends on who controls knowledge. Law schools cannot function properly as knowledge communities if their view of knowledge is disparaged, marginalized, or suppressed because it conflicts with that of the profession. If legal orthodoxy has a privileged place on the curriculum and a preemptive claim on resources, if research, graduate studies, and public advocacy are perceived to derogate from the core mission of law schools or as mere decorative appendages to that mission. Well then, if the academy must be free to collect, critique, and disseminate knowledge as it thinks best, how should it use that freedom? In two ways. First, in a legal universe that's increasingly chaotic, it's the academy's job to make sense of it all. The academy should therefore chronicle change, identify continuities and discontinuities, demonstrate causes and effects, explain whose interests and which values are being advanced or attacked. It should advocate for change intelligently when it deserves support and fiercely resist it when it doesn't. And the academy should wrestle with change. It should propose new statutes, conjure up new doctrines, and invent new instruments of private governance. And second, the academy must not only think about, write about, and wrestle with change, it must equip its students, the future architects and artisans of legal change, with the tools that they need. As the CBA discussion paper makes clear, change will force legal scholars and students, legal practitioners and policymakers to explore new domains of theoretical and practical knowledge. Academics in adjacent disciplines, experts in government agencies and private consultancies, leaders in business and social movements all have a great deal to tell us. To engage these relevant others in meaningful conversations, we must learn to talk to them in their own vernacular. This is perhaps our greatest challenge, to learn to integrate law talk with other discourses. Putting change at the center of what they do will be hard for law schools, especially with regard to lawyer training functions. However, in my view, they've already made a good start. First, law schools have generally abandoned the notion that legal education is only about teaching legal rules. Instead, law schools generally aim to train their students to think like lawyers, to develop generic analytical and critical skills that can be deployed over time and across a wide variety of legal and non-legal contexts. This is certainly better than insisting, as law societies perversely do, that all lawyers must know the same things. But the current strategy is still somewhat problematic. Perhaps like pornography, we can recognize law think when we see it. However, there's little empirical evidence that all lawyers think alike, that they analyze legal problems in similar fashion, that law think occupies a significant part of their working days, or for that matter, that lawyers think differently from, say, social workers, philosophers, or corporate executives. Indeed, within legal academic circles, there is a robust debate about what it means to think like a lawyer. One distinguished legal scholar has recently argued that thinking like a lawyer is thinking like a human being who is tolerant, sophisticated, pragmatic, and engaged. On the other hand, there's an extensive literature that argues to the contrary, that thinking like a lawyer involves a distinctive repertoire of analytical and discursive techniques. But whichever position one favors, it's important to remember that lawyers who can't, won't, or don't also think like human beings are quite likely to harm themselves, their clients, the reputation of the bar, and the effectiveness of the legal system. This leads me to a second strategy, interdisciplinarity, which law schools have been preaching for decades and occasionally actually practice. Interdisciplinarity takes many forms. Joint degree programs, the cross-appointment of scholars from other disciplines to teach in law school, so-called law and or perspective courses, and most commonly, casebook and classroom references to economic, political, sociological, philosophical, or historical perspectives on legal issues. Interdisciplinary teaching is difficult. Many law professors aren't well trained or well read in other disciplines. Appropriate materials are sometimes hard to come by. Students are often resistant. However, most legal academics, like, by the way, the CBA, are convinced that interdisciplinarity is an essential element of any response to change. It shakes lawyers loose from the notion that law is unchanging and unchangeable. It gets them into a habit of thinking outside the legal box, and it helps them better understand just what's in that box. Interdisciplinarity, depending on your point of view, is either a complement to or a corrective to thinking like a lawyer. A third related law school strategy, long ago adopted by law schools, but still, I'm afraid, resisted by the profession, is the optional curriculum. Optionalization is meant to engage students intellectually and at the same time to help them prepare for varied and unpredictable futures. There's not much downside to the optional curriculum. If law schools are primarily teaching students how to think, one subject will serve as well as another. And in fact, the optional curriculum has distinct advantages. Students with different career aspirations will sensibly want to study subjects that advance those aspirations. Consequently, optionalization enhances motivation. And there's another advantage. If graduates are going to have to educate themselves during their future careers in order to adapt to change, they must learn to learn. The optional curriculum, if it's carefully structured and involves advanced, interdisciplinary, and capstone courses, as well as research and writing and experiential requirements, the optional curriculum ensures that students will do just that. In particular, it allows them to develop integrative skills and teaches them to locate what they've learned in a larger and more flexible frame that can absorb new material as it comes their way over the years. And one more point. The optional curriculum gives law teachers an opportunity to use their classroom or seminar room as a testing ground for new ideas and as a conduit for disseminating those ideas to future generations of practitioners and policymakers. Consequently, it's an important vehicle for the renewal of the legal profession and the justice system. Finally, law schools are increasingly committed to experiential learning. They believe that immersing students in real or simulated legal situations has several advantages. Like the optional curriculum, experiential learning enhances motivation. It exposes students to certain intractable facts of legal life, the legal power of deep pockets, for example, or the stultifying effects of déformation professionnelle that are difficult to convey through conventional course materials. And it incites them to think critically and systemically as well as analytically. But I'll add a note of caution. There's a risk that experiential learning can degenerate into mere skills training. Obviously, if students do learn something about negotiating or counseling or advocacy, that's a good thing. However, experiential learning isn't simply to show students how to put law think to practical use. It's to enable them to confront the normative, the logistical, the relational issues that are imminent in all legal encounters. In this sense, the success of experiential learning depends ultimately on the strength of law schools as knowledge communities, on their ability to provide students with the context and perspective that will allow them to make sense of what they've just observed or experienced. The future of law schools, then, is to embrace their vocation as knowledge communities, to embed their JD and other educational programs within their larger mandate of aggregating, critiquing, and disseminating knowledge, and to pay attention to the challenge of rapid and profound changes in society and in law. I've identified 4 useful strategies that they've adopted to teach students to think like lawyers, to contextualize and critically evaluate their legal experiences, to adapt to change, and especially to learn how to learn. Now I have to address a really tough question. If that's all that law schools do, is it enough? If their graduates don't have specific legal skills and don't know substantive law, aren't they likely to be a risk to their clients, their colleagues, and their liability insurers? I think not. There's good reason to believe that new graduates with limited knowledge of substantive law and a limited repertoire of skills can still end up as highly successful practitioners. After all, many famous jurists had very rudimentary legal educations. Many leading specialists today never took courses in the fields in which they excel, Peter Hogg on Canadian constitutional law being a case in point. And most skilled advocates, draftspersons, and negotiators learned their skills on the job, not at law school. In the United States, graduates of law schools that prize scholarship, schools with wide-open curricula that emphasize thinking skills, theory, and interdisciplinarity, graduates from those schools fare comparatively well even in today's difficult legal market. They're far more likely to be hired and for better jobs than graduates of the other sort of schools, those whose faculties don't publish and whose curricula emphasize basics and preparation for practice. And the large consulting firms that compete successfully with law firms in many key markets tend to hire people on the basis of their intellectual abilities, not their professional competencies. Nor is any of this surprising. In most labor markets today, sophisticated and adaptable knowledge workers tend to fare better than semi-skilled workers with a limited repertoire of know-how which is closely aligned to the current modus operandi of particular employers or trades. Let me carry that last thought forward. If my original description of the legal profession is divided by deep fault lines is anywhere near accurate, the bar may one day recognize not just one class of members, but many. Members of each class would have different educational credentials and a limited license to practice, just as Ontario paralegals and solicitors do today. I can imagine, for example, that general practitioners will one day be licensed, say, to appear as advocates in certain tribunals and lower courts, to handle routine real estate transactions, simple incorporations, and uncontested divorces, but not, say, appellate litigation, copyright applications, or tax planning. The classes of membership would likely not be watertight. There would likely be competition, for example, between paralegals and general practitioners in the provision of routine services. And members of each class would have the chance to move up the ladder. If such a system of limited licensing were adopted, the future of law schools would look quite different from the one I've proposed. They might offer a skills-based one-year degree for paralegals, a stripped-down two-year basic degree for general practitioners, an enhanced four-year degree for specialists, and of course conversion courses for those who want to upgrade their credentials. This model has some obvious attractions. It saves time and money for those who end up in general practice. It ensures that higher-level lawyers possess the theoretical, analytical, and contextual sophistication required to deal with complex and multidimensional issues. It enables law schools to customize their curricula to fit their students' diverse needs, and it enables the profession to better serve the public. These are all definite advantages, but there are risks as well. A clear division between faculty members who teach basics to paralegals and general practitioners and those who teach future legal specialists, intellectuals, and policy advisors is likely to engender squabbles over the soul of law schools, or at least over their budgets. And there are risks for students too. Stripping the generalist program down to basics might foreshorten their horizons and stunt the ambitions of students enrolled in the general program. But don't worry about the risks. It's not going to happen. Law schools won't be redesigned to support a system of multiple professional credentials because the profession will never adopt such a system. For the foreseeable future, there'll be only one professional credential, barrister and solicitor, and only one main route to obtaining that credential via an approved JD degree, one that ticks all the boxes specified in the new Law Society regulations. But that said, it will be difficult to tick those boxes if law schools remain true to their character as knowledge communities, if they persevere with scholarship, law reform, public advocacy, and graduate studies, and if they insist on giving JD students a liberal education in law. Law schools are going to have to somehow square that circle. They will either have to challenge the new regulations directly, or they will have to fake compliance and hope that no one catches them. If they don't, there will be more and more boxes to tick and less opportunity to do all the other things that law schools should be doing. So, the future of law schools is uncertain. All the social, political, and intellectual forces that shape legal education are in flux. And the future of law schools is contested. The academy and the profession are fundamentally at odds over the nature of knowledge, the best way to educate lawyers, and many other matters. And the future of law schools is plural. Different law schools will have different futures. Nonetheless, I'm going to venture a prediction. When this law school celebrates its bicentenary in 2012-13, when speakers look back on its second century of accomplishment, they will mention distinguished scholarship more often than skills training. They will mention its long-term contributions to the public good more than its immediate influence on present-day legal practice. And they will mention its role as an agent of change more often than its role as a faithful purveyor of conventional wisdom. Taking the long view and focusing on change will, I know, seem like typical academic self-indulgence to those of you whose job it is to ensure that the public receives high-quality professional services in the here and now. Describing law schools as multifunctional knowledge communities rather than institutions single-mindedly, devotedly training of practice-ready lawyers will seem like callous indifference to the plight of students and recent graduates who face mounting debts and declining job opportunities. And my apparent downgrading of hard law and how-to courses, and my privileging of theory and thinking, of interdisciplinarity and contextualization, will appall, I know, some of my academic colleagues. To all of the above, I apologize if, as they say, I have inadvertently given offense. But I'm willing to bet that 100 years from now, people will agree that the vision of the law school as a knowledge community is the right vision. Not just the right vision, but the only vision that will allow legal education to improve professional competence and behavior, the only vision that can ensure law graduates a chance to prosper in a changing society and volatile labor market, the only vision that will challenge and sustain the men and women of the legal academy. Thank you.
We have, well, officially we have about 7 minutes, but I think I've got some wiggle room from Professor Adams for a little more time for Q&A, but if you can keep your questions short, we can accommodate more. Okay, so everyone's in agreement with what Professor Arthur said. Oh, Professor Sawson.
Yeah, I just found it a very subtle and ambiguous talk, so I'm not really sure what your point was, but here's
That's why you're a dean.
Yes. So here's the place I think you're going, but I want to invite you to be more explicit about whether this is a way to synthesize the various visions of law school. You know, those of us who've been reading the recent ABA report or talking in the hallways about, of course, this very issue that has been galvanizing so much debate, I think want to embrace a different Canadian approach, and one in which scholarship and the knowledge community is very much tied to the preparation of people for a range of careers, but as you've pointed out, careers in legal practice among them, and that not a juxtaposition, but in fact a mutually reinforcing dynamic is what one ought to aim for, and what's distinctly missing, for example, from that ABA report, or so much of the debate that seems to feed on the polarizing. So you've said from time to time that that's your view as well, but then you also from time to time come back to this idea of the knowledge community, critical reflection, interdisciplinarity, very much as distinct from a place driven by those other concerns. So are we right to take from your talk the argument that if you do want to best support the profession, among the other goals, you ought to be deeply committed to scholarship and knowledge community and the other values you've articulated?
You did get my point after all, precisely. Just to pick up on what Lauren said and try to capture it in a sentence or two, to the extent that our mission is the preparation of lawyers for professional practice, in my view, the central aspect of proper preparation is serious intellectual work. And that involves a view of knowledge as contingent, as interdependent with other domains of knowledge. I won't reiterate everything I said in the paper, but a view of knowledge that deviates considerably from the view that's implicit and sometimes explicit in the profession's prescriptions for legal education.
Hi, I'm Andy Strauss. I'm Dean of Faculty at Widener Law School in Delaware in the U.S. I liked everything that you said and find myself largely in agreement. My question goes to something that you didn't address, and that is what the best way to impart this knowledge is, and whether the sort of traditional pedagogies that we've used in law schools is best. And I find that with an awful lot of our students that they're not getting, if you look at law schools as a knowledge community and trying to impart ways of thinking in complex ways about information, about ideas, that we're not doing a very good job of that. And specifically, and from what I hear, it's not just our students, that a lot of students are graduating without the ability to write practitioner briefs and memos, much less, much more academic types of work. So I'm interested in your ideas on that.
Thank you. I agree with you that pedagogy has to be devised which is appropriate to the strategy at hand. And I'm very pleased with experiments in pedagogy that are ongoing. Some of them using the technologies that we heard about this morning, some of them using experiential learning that Lauren Sossin will talk about in a little while, a whole variety of pedagogic strategies, not all of which are suitable for all of the jobs that they are meant to do. I would argue, and some people will disagree, for example, that serious theorizing is not optimally conveyed through experiential learning. That people actually need to sit and read and think and talk. They may be motivated to do that by something they've encountered in the context of a legal clinic or whatever, but serious immersion and reflection on text is appropriate for certain kinds of material. Getting a systemic view of a legal problem, locating the problem in its systemic context, it's essential to experience that context first or second hand and not just read about it in order to grasp the emotional dynamic and the political dynamic of the situation. So I believe somebody in the last day or so has made the point that the case method just doesn't do it. I don't think it does it in terms of skills training. I don't think it does it in terms of intellectual comprehension. It has a certain limited value. I think we all know what that value is. I'm not suggesting we entirely get rid of the cabbage shredding of appellate decisions, but it has a very limited value and shouldn't preoccupy us, and I think is increasingly not preoccupying us. So my only commentary on your question is, by all means, we have to try more and better pedagogic strategies, but we have to be mindful that some are more appropriate for some kinds of learning than others.
My understanding of the strategy of the deans in the previous iteration of debates with the Federation of Law Societies regarding the accreditation process was that they were not willing to relinquish the premise that a law degree was a sufficient and necessary condition for access to the profession. Was that the right strategy, and should that be revisited?
You're a dean, tell me.
Well, I was not part of that group, and that's why I'm asking. I think there might have been a different position taken by the deans at that point. They might have said to the Federation, you control access to the profession. You decide what you want people to have in their pockets in order to be proficient legal professionals. We'll do what we do. If you decide that's good enough, that's good enough. If not, too bad. We're still happy with what we do.
I would have preferred that position to the one that the deans took, which I think will come back to haunt them in the years to come. I think is already coming back to haunt them. Issues are arising about whether the list originally proclaimed is the whole list, or whether we'll see rapid accretion of new requirements. I would have preferred a bilateral approach which said, perhaps you can't do the job, perhaps we can't do the job, perhaps we ought to be thinking about new institutions, new strategies for doing the job that falls between two stools, which is preparation for today's practice and tomorrow's practice. And that's, obviously, it's an important job. And there are multiple aspects to that job. Which of them can best be done in the academy? Which can best be done by the profession? Now, having said that, I think we have to understand that it's not merely a matter of which is best. There's a lot at stake here, not least of which is who will bear the cost. The trend that we've seen in these last years, and we're going to see much more of, is the profession sloughing off the cost that it used to bear through the articling system and the mentorship system, sloughing off the cost onto the law schools. And the result is that the law schools have either to acquire more resources, an unlikely prospect at the moment, or they have to redeploy their existing resources to take on new responsibilities. And again, I cite the teaching of professional responsibility as a good example of that. I'm not saying law schools shouldn't do it, but it's not costless. And there is a cost-shifting element here. There's also a question of power and a question of politics. Every year, as you will find out very shortly if you're still in office, you're going to have to sign your name to a letter that says, Dear Federation of Law Societies, I hereby certify that by the following detailed means, my law school has brought itself into compliance with your requirements. Now, when you begin to sign those letters every year, and you go to a faculty meeting, and the faculty says, why are we teaching X as a compulsory subject? Why don't we teach Y? It makes much more sense to teach Y. Why have I had to give up my graduate seminar to teach professional responsibility? Who's running this show anyway? And the dean says, for God's sake, don't make trouble or we'll lose our accreditation. And a new dynamic, always latent in these discussions in law faculty councils. How will it affect our relationship with the bar? But there's a not very subtle shift in the power equation in that relationship when accreditation is on the line on an annual basis, and a long shadow is cast by that seemingly innocuous requirement into the whole dynamic of academic decision-making.
Appears to have cheered everyone with that.
Okay.
Well, on your behalf then, colleagues, I will thank Professor Arthurs for a stimulating, if entirely depressing, talk. Thank you.